On January 27, 2026, world number 3 Coco Gauff walked off Rod Laver Arena believing she had finally found a quiet corner of Melbourne Park where the cameras could not follow her, only to discover hours later that even this supposed safe space had been turned into content and broadcast to the world after her straight sets Australian Open quarterfinal defeat to Elina Svitolina. In footage that went viral within minutes, Gauff was seen smashing her racket in a back-of-house corridor she thought was private, a moment of raw frustration that suddenly became a global talking point and the trigger for an ugly new battle over how far broadcasters and tournaments can push behind-the-scenes access in women's tennis. According to multiple reports, the American told reporters she had deliberately gone looking for an area without cameras because she did not want to be seen breaking a racket, only to find out that a security-style angle had been captured and used anyway. She linked the moment directly to a previous incident involving Aryna Sabalenka, recalling that after the 2023 US Open final, broadcasters had aired footage of the Belarusian smashing a racket in a training area she also thought was off-limits, and asking why these outbursts needed to be turned into repeated replays rather than left as private decompression moments. The question landed with force because it crystallized something many top women had been quietly feeling for years. They were no longer sure where the line between public performance and personal space actually existed at the biggest events on the calendar. Within 24 hours, Gauff's complaint had detonated into a full-blown player versus tournament feud about cameras in corridors, tunnels, and player-only walkways across the Australian Open site. In her press conference, Gauff argued that at this tournament, the only truly private place left was the locker room, stressing that she did not object to match coverage, but to the constant surveillance feel of lenses in almost every off-court zone where players tried to cool down, regroup, or express emotion away from the crowd. Jessica Pegula backed her, describing the situation as a violation of privacy and saying players should not have to worry that every meltdown or quiet conversation is being recorded for social media. Iga Swiatek went even further, saying that at times women felt like animals in a zoo, watched in every vulnerable moment and unsure where they could simply be human without becoming a viral clip. These were not fringe voices or low-ranked outsiders complaining about the grind. They were some of the most marketable stars in tennis, openly challenging the way tournaments and broadcasters have been creeping more cameras into so-called backstage spaces since 2019 in the name of access. As those quotes ricocheted around the sport, the Australian Open's carefully curated image as a cutting-edge, fan-friendly Grand Slam suddenly collided with a much harsher question. Had the quest for immersive coverage quietly trampled over the basic dignity of the athletes who make the show possible? To understand why the Coco Gauff footage hit such a nerve, you have to look at how the camera map at the Australian Open 2026 actually works, and how far it has drifted from what most players believed they were signing up for. Since the late 2010s, tournaments and broadcast partners have steadily rolled out more fixed and roaming cameras in corridors, arrival zones, and warm-up walkways, promising fans an intimate look at players lacing up shoes, pacing in tunnels, and sharing quick words with coaches before battle. Tournament officials argue that these spaces are not technically private because they are operational corridors and routes to the court where staff and media already circulate, and that locker rooms, treatment areas, recovery rooms, beauty rooms, and dedicated sleep spaces at Melbourne Park remain camera-free. The Australian Open's leadership framed the new angles as a delicate balance between showcasing players' personalities and safeguarding their comfort, insisting there are still coaches' rooms and other enclaves without cameras where teams can talk freely. On paper, that sounds like a reasonable compromise. In practice, what Gauff described was a lived reality where the corridors, ramps, and off-court holding areas that used to feel like decompression buffers now feel like extensions of the stadium, wired up for instant clip-and-share content. That disconnect between the formal policy and the player experience is exactly where the resentment has been building. For Coco Gauff, the story was painfully simple. After one of the most brutal defeats of her young career, she walked off court, tried to find a spot where she could let the anger out without harming anyone or putting on a show, and smashed a racket believing the cameras were finally gone. Instead, one of those corridor cameras caught everything. The clip was packaged and pushed across television and social feeds, turning a private coping mechanism into yet another talking point about her temperament and pressure management, and raising the question of consent. When asked about it later, she said she had an issue with the broadcast and that she had deliberately chosen that spot because she thought there was no camera, adding that the only place that felt truly private at this tournament was the locker room. She referenced Sabalenka's experience after the 2023 US Open final, when the Belarusian smashed a racket in what she believed was an off-camera practice area, only to see the footage amplified globally, and suggested that not every emotional crack needs to be monetized. The parallel was not accidental. In both cases, a top-tier women's star tried to step away from the show, only to have the show follow her into spaces she assumed were beyond the lens. That shared sense of being ambushed by the broadcast has turned a couple of isolated blowups into Exhibit A and Exhibit B in a wider case about systemic overreach. Aryna Sabalenka's name looms over this controversy even though she did not trigger it in Melbourne. Her earlier post-US Open blowup, captured in a training area and replayed repeatedly, became a reference point for Gauff and for commentators trying to explain why the Australian Open 2026 coverage felt different. When Gauff told reporters that the same thing happened to Aryna after I played her in the final of the US Open, she was reminding fans that this is not a one-off accident, but part of a pattern where women's private moments of anger are turned into spectacle. At this Australian Open, Sabalenka's on-court results kept her in the spotlight as usual, but it was the memory of that previous humiliation, smashed racket and all, that made the latest corridor footage feel like déjà vu rather than a fresh misstep. Players talk, and those stories circulate. The camera that caught Sabalenka in a supposedly tucked-away training zone, the camera in Melbourne corridor that found Gauff. These are not just gentle, behind-the-scenes glimpses. In the minds of many players, they are ambush shots, the kind broadcasters would never dream of airing if the subject were an executive or a sponsor erupting in a restricted area. That double standard feeds the sense that the athletes' emotional lives are being treated as free, raw material. By late January, the outrage had grown loud enough that the WTA could not stay silent, and the tour issued a strongly worded statement framed as a defense of its players' privacy at the Australian Open. The organization said it supported its players and took their concerns about cameras in off-court areas very seriously, stressing that athletes deserve spaces away from competition where they can rest and recover in complete privacy, and calling those concerns completely valid and a very human and fair demand. The WTA also highlighted that at its own events, it had already taken steps to reduce camera presence in non-competition player areas, creating designated zones where players could be sure they were not being filmed, and urged tournament organizers and broadcast partners to review their policies and establish clear, respectful boundaries. New WTA chair Valerie Camillo personally underlined the message, saying athletes need spaces where they don't feel constantly under scrutiny, and promising dialogue with both players and tournaments to shape a solution. On the surface, it was the kind of decisive, pro-player language fans had been asking for from the tour in other controversies. But the timing and the omissions also tell a story. The statement came only after Gauff's footage had blown up, and after other stars like Iga Swiatek and Pegula had gone public, and it stopped short of naming the Australian Open or any specific broadcaster or threatening concrete sanctions if boundaries kept being pushed. That gap between rhetoric and enforcement is where this begins to look less like a single tournament misstep and more like a systemic failure. The WTA statement made it clear that the tour has already dialed back cameras in off-court areas at its own events, yet the most invasive footage currently enraging players comes from a Grand Slam run by Australian tennis in partnership with major broadcasters, where the WTA has influence but not direct control. The organization called for policies to be reviewed and for more private spaces to be created, but it did not say, if this happens again, our players will not participate in specific behind-the-scenes shoots, or we will instruct our members not to cooperate with certain formats until clear boundaries are signed off. In practical terms, that means that the rights holders and tournaments who actively chose to point cameras into ever more intimate player corridors have so far faced no real penalty beyond bad headlines. The shockwaves from Gauff clip may change behavior at the margins, but there has been no formal investigation, no removal of controversial feeds, no public naming of which broadcaster decided the corridor footage was fair game, and no indication that the WTA is prepared to use scheduling leverage or promotional power to force through reforms. For players who already felt like their voices were secondary to commercial interests, that looks less like protection and more like damage control. To grasp why players talk about feeling like zoo exhibits, you have to see this privacy scandal in the context of tennis's broader arms race for content. Over the past decade, every major sport has tried to bring fans closer than ever with locker room cams, tunnel mics, documentary crews, and always-on social feeds. And tennis has been racing to catch up with team sports that have long had all-access shows and wired benches. The Australian Open has been particularly aggressive in marketing its behind-the-scenes coverage, adding more cameras and walkways and holding areas starting around 2019, and selling those angles as a way to humanize stars and show their pre-match rituals and post-match reactions. For rights holders chasing engagement, a smashed racket in a concrete corridor is gold, authentic emotion in an environment that looks raw and unscripted. For the player who thought she had finally escaped the red light, it feels more like a trap. That clash of incentives explains why even after Gauff's complaints, tournament officials were still talking publicly about the need to keep reviewing camera placement, rather than immediately ripping out hardware. From their perspective, they had simply extended match coverage into adjacent spaces. From the player's perspective, the line between work and personhood had been crossed. There's also a clear gender and power dimension to how this scandal has unfolded. The loudest voices demanding boundaries have been women: Gauff, Swiatek, Pegula, and others, calling the current setup a violation of privacy and saying they should not have to hunt blindly for a safe corner just to cry or smash a racket after a loss. The WTA, a body that exists to represent their interests, responded with strong words but limited leverage over a Grand Slam that sits inside a separate governance structure and answers primarily to its own board and commercial partners. Meanwhile, the same general push for extra cameras exists on the men's side, but the flashpoint examples dominating coverage are a young American woman and a Belarusian multiple major champion being filmed in moments of emotional breakdown, clips then looped for days as part of bigger storylines about their mental toughness. The message this sends to players is that their vulnerability is a commodity, and that institutions will apologize only up to the point where revenue, ratings, and contractual obligations are threatened. That imbalance between who gets to decide and who gets exposed is at the heart of the resentment simmering in the women's locker rooms. There are practical solutions on the table, but implementing them would require tournaments and broadcasters to accept limits on access they have grown used to. Players and the WTA have effectively proposed a simple map, clearly marked camera-free corridors and decompression rooms between the locker room and the media mixed zone, strict bans on using security footage for broadcast without prior consent, and written agreements defining which backstage angles are acceptable and which are off-limits. Tournament officials claim some of this already exists in the form of coach rooms and staff-only zones, but the Gauff incident shows those safeguards are not obvious enough to the people who are supposed to benefit from them. One solution would be to create a designated no broadcast corridor that every player passes through immediately after leaving the court, a short stretch where they can breathe, curse, smash a racket, or just walk silently without worrying about cameras. Another would be to force broadcasters to run all off-court emotional clips past players or their teams for approval before airing, at least in the immediate aftermath of a loss. These approaches would not stop documentaries or long-term storytelling, but they would hand back some control over how and when the most vulnerable seconds of an athlete's day are shared. Right now, though, none of those reforms are guaranteed, and that uncertainty is what turns this from a single scandal into a long-term test of the WTA's ability to protect her players when the pressure comes from outside its own tour. The WTA has signaled that it wants fewer cameras in off-court areas and has publicly called player concerns valid, but it has not yet shown it can compel independent tournaments, like the Australian Open, to redraw their camera plans by 2027. If nothing substantial changes before the next Grand Slam cycle, players could face the same dilemma again: suppress their emotions to avoid becoming content, or risk being captured by a lens they never agreed to. For Coco Gauff and Aryna Sabalenka, the damage is already done, their private frustrations forever frozen and replayed as part of the sport's highlight reel of meltdowns. The real question is whether their humiliation becomes the last straw that forces tennis to draw a bright, enforceable line between performance and privacy, or just another viral moment the sport mines for clicks.